Well, good morning. It is good to see everybody this morning. Nathan's down in Georgia somewhere, hanging around with some friends of his and actually being spiritually uplifted. They're having a retreat down there. There's an opportunity for him to get some spiritual feeding himself. So he feeds us every Sunday. It was time for him to get fed. So that's where he's at this week. So you have to deal with me. But I've had this lesson for a while. I guess I better turn this on. Sorry about the distraction. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and then we're going to do part of chapter 10 too. So please be turning there. That's where I'm going to be bringing our lesson from this morning. Paul takes a page out of Jesus' teaching methods. Jesus taught using physical analogies that people could understand and then making a spiritual application. And Paul does that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We'll be starting in verse 24 and 27. He talks about running a race. Follow along if you would, verse 24 through 27. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air. But I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. So Paul is using a physical analogy. There were games that were held in Corinth. They were called the Isthmian Games. And the first ones were held in Corinth in 582 BC. So that was well before Paul came around. So they've been being held for a long time. It was an established time for games. There were Olympic games going on, but these were in different years that they held the Isthmian Games. The festival included athletic and musical competitions to honor the god Poseidon. And Poseidon was a Greek god of the sea, of the ocean, and it was held in the spring of the second and fourth years of each Olympiad at Poseidon's rural sanctuary on the Isthmus of Corinth, the small neck of land that connects the Peloponnesian Peninsula with central Greece. Since it was easy to reach both from land and sea, the Isthmia was a natural meeting place. And we've learned from past studies that, yes, there's an isthmus there. It's easy to get from one sea to the next. A lot of times they drug boats across this isthmus to get to the other side. But again, here's a list of things that were happening with these games. One of the things that the prize was a wreath of celery. And when I read this, the first person I thought of was Ron Burke, because he always talked about how he didn't like celery, right? So a wreath of celery, boy, that's really something to go for, right? In the Olympics now, we go for gold medals. Prize, even a trophy would be better than a wreath of celery, right? Unless you're really hungry and you got a jar of peanut butter with you. Later, they were made out of pine boughs. And this was the perishable wreath that Paul was talking about. They were running a race for a perishable wreath, and they trained and tried to win for that. And he says our wreath is an imperishable one. Has anyone ever run a 5K? Show of hands. And I can't raise my hand. Anybody in here run a 5K? Have you run a 5K, Gilbert?
Yes, sir.
Wow, how did you train for that?
Every day.
Every day you what? Ran around the block or what?
Ran.
Did you do the Boston Marathon, perchance? You were in Boston for a while, right? Did you go down and watch the Boston Marathon? Okay. So if nobody's ever run a 5K, the next question is probably kind of a mute question, right? How about 100 meters? Do we have any 100-meter dashers here? Sam, did you run in high school or? Forced to. I'm talking about in a competition, brother.
I ran a mile.
You ran a mile? Okay, and was that in high school or college? High school? How did you train for that, Jay?
Every day.
Every day. Okay, so we got two people. Obviously, we're not a very physically fit congregation, right? Because nobody out here runs. I've never really had a desire to run. You know, I went out for track in junior high, and that lasted about 2 days. I said, "This is about as boring as it gets." You know, but running is really boring to me. But we see from the two examples of people in here that have actually ran. That they trained every day, right? It was an everyday thing. I got to get this guy's name pronounced correctly. Has anybody ever heard of Dean Karnazes? Me either. I'd never heard of this guy. This is one of those Google searches that we were talking about. Famous runners. I punched in famous runners, and this is one of the guys that came up. Here are some of the things that Dean has accomplished, and his list is long. This was just a few of the things that he has done. 50 marathons in 50 days in 50 states. Whew, is right. Now, I'm just off the top of my head, I'm thinking he didn't start in Florida and then go to Alaska and Rhode Island. I imagine they were close together, but still. One marathon a year would be enough for me. But he did 50 in 50 days in 50 states. 350 miles in 80 hours, 44 minutes with no sleep. Okay? I could not last 80 hours without running. Maybe running helped him keep awake, right? 34 hours straight was the longest I could stay awake. And when I laid down, I didn't wake up for another 34 hours. It was incredible. I can't even imagine that, right? Is this unfathomable to us to be able to do this stuff, right? I picked somebody that he accomplished things that are extreme, okay? If you haven't noticed that. He did a marathon on the South Pole in below 13-degree weather, and he ran from Disneyland to New York in 75 days. These were extreme things. First of all, he had to set a goal to accomplish this, right? He had to have an aim. We don't just wake up one morning and says, you know what, I think today I'm going to do 50 marathons in 50 states in 50 days. So he had a goal, and he had to train for that goal. I don't know what his training methods are. I'm pretty sure he had a diet that he stuck to. It wasn't the David Engel diet. I can guarantee you that, right? All-you-can-eat buffets probably didn't enter into his diet. But he was focused on doing these things. Otherwise, he would not have accomplished them. We don't just get born one day and we're 50 marathon, 50-day, 50-state people. It's something you have to train for. And that's what Paul is talking about here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Do you not know that every one of us is running a race? And it's an individual race, folks. God has established the church, yes, to do his works, so that we can encourage one another. But ultimately, we all have our own individual race when we're racing for God. I guess I don't know if that's a term, but we're racing for God. Because he says each one of us is going to stand before the judgment throne. You know, Rose isn't going to get to take my place. As much as I would love to have St. Rose take my place, she's not going to be able to. Rose is running her own race, and I'm running my race. And so we have to have that understanding that we are in control of the race that we run. Paul says that only one receives the prize. There's no second, no third, no fourth place trophies, There's no participation trophy. You know, I know most of us come from the generation where when you win something, right? And you try to win. But there are a lot of events now where these kids are, oh, you showed up. Here, have a trophy, you know. You didn't really accomplish anything, but you showed up and you came and you got to participate. We don't want to make you feel bad because this guy over here is better than you and got a trophy. And even though he might have worked harder at what he's doing, we don't want anybody to feel bad, right? That's not the case in our Christian run. There are no participation trophies. We're not competing against each other. I'm not competing against Sam. I'm not competing against Jay. I'm competing actually against the devil. In fact, Ephesians 6:12 says, our fight is not against flesh and blood. Well, I'm going to, so that I don't misquote it. I've been known to misquote verses before, so. Ephesians 6:12, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of darkness in the heavenly places. That's who we're competing against. We're here to help each other. We're here to encourage each other in our race. You know, I was out for wrestling. Wrestling is a team and individual sport. When you go out on the mat and wrestle, you're the guy wrestling. The other people were there to help you at practice and wrestle and show you moves, and we did have a team score, but when you're on the mat, it's just you and the other guy. There is a lot of preparation into wrestling. If you've never wrestled wrestling for 6 minutes, you have to have some stamina to do that. It's amazing how much it takes to wrestle. But it's just me and the other guy. And that's the way it is with our race. It's us running this race. Paul says you have to exercise self-control. We see you've seen where self-control is one of the fruits of the Spirit, one of the fruit of the Spirit. The self-control is, you got to get up and train every day, right, Gilbert? That takes discipline, takes self-control. You have to moderate what you eat. That takes self-control. And so what Paul is talking about when we're running this race, we have to have self-control. When there are things that are tempting us in this life, things that are trying to distract us from our focus on God, we have to have self-control. I have the pleasure of coaching some young first and second graders in flag football. And it's quite an experience for me because their focus is anywhere but me. You know? In fact, we got to the point where we hide the footballs now because you put a football out there and it's just like recess, and they're throwing the ball around and not listening, and it's very tough to get them focused on what they're supposed to be focused on. It's amazing. And all 12 of them. I think there is one young man, he does pay attention. And I told his father the other day, I said, you have a real nice, well-mannered son here. He listens to me all the time. He does a really good job. He says, and he looks at his son. He says, how come you don't do that at home? Our focus. So I guess I brought that up. Are we like a bunch of first and second graders in our Christian walk that we lose our focus? We're just doing all the things that the world wants us to do. It's attractive out there, and we lose our focus on running the race. It'd be easy to do. And as I'm doing this lesson, I'm preaching from a standpoint that I see myself that way oftentimes, that I lose my focus. I lose where the goal is. I lose what I'm doing. and what I want to accomplish and where I want to be. So then he talks about disciplining, being disciplined in this race that we're running. He says in verse 26, therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. The discipline he's talking about there, literally the word discipline, and I have it in my next slide. No, that's disqualified. Discipline is literally, the Greek word is punching yourself under your eye. I better do it over here or I'll mess up the mic. Punching yourself under the eye. Why would you punch yourself under the eye? Well, he talks about boxing there, and if you're a boxer, you ever seen those movies where the guy's beating them in the gut so it strengthens their gut up, and they spar and they take a few hits, so that you're used to getting a hit. And that's what Paul is saying. I discipline my body. Look at the things that Paul went through. The fact that he was shipwrecked, he was hungry, he was beaten, he was stoned. For most people, wouldn't that cause you to quit running the race? Right? About the first time you get stoned. This isn't much fun. I'm out of here. And so Paul is saying, I have to discipline this body of mine. And it talks about a perishable wreath. We talked a little bit earlier about the celery wreath, but ours is imperishable. Jesus talks about everlasting life with the Father. What a goal. What a trophy, right? I guess if we want to call it a trophy. What a prize. I'll put it that way. What a prize. Everlasting life with God. That is our hope. That is what we're running for. That is what we're trying to accomplish. The one thing that really stuck out to me as I was reading this and preparing this, verse 27, but I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. What? How can Paul be disqualified? Paul, you can be disqualified? Can Paul fall from grace? Can Paul not finish the race? Absolutely. That's what he's saying. Paul, in the very first part of chapter 9, says, I who have seen Jesus. You saw Jesus. How could it be that you would fall from grace? How would it be that you'd be disqualified? This is the Greek word for disqualified, unable to stand the test, rejected, refused, worthless. How could he be rejected by the Lord? Could Paul fall from grace? If you think about being disqualified from a race, you look at the Olympics where they're passing the baton, and if you drop the baton, you're out, right? If you go past this certain line, when you're passing the baton, you took too long to give the baton to the other guy, you're out of there. If you jump before the gun goes off, I think they give you a second chance, right? Before you're disqualified. And Paul is talking about being disqualified from this race. How much, and focus seems to be the word that keeps coming up. How much focus and discipline did Paul have to have? How much do we have to have? Paul, the one who wrote many letters that we have in the Bible, who the Spirit gave him the word to write, says, I have to make sure that in my race I'm not disqualified myself. So then we get into 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 6. Let's read that together. For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. They ate the same spiritual food. God gave them manna in the desert, right? But they also gave him the law. They gave them the law of Moses, the word. They drank the same spiritual drink. It talks about the water that they were provided was the spiritual drink. Jesus says, I am the living water in John 4:10 and 11. Jesus says, I am the bread of heaven, John 6:32 through 33. A spiritual rock which they had was Christ. They all went through the sea. They all were being led by the cloud. They all saw it. Yet some of them didn't believe. Some of them craved evil things and followed those. Yet some of them were faithful. Remember Joshua and Caleb. So they experienced the same things, but they had different reactions to them. Folks, we're in that same boat. God has given us his word through Jesus Christ. We can all read this. We can all read this. We all have the words of life. The decisions we make in our life is what counts towards our race. Does that make sense? Am I saying it correctly? I mean, I don't have any advantage over any of you. We're all under the same word of God. It's our learning it and applying it in this race that we're running that makes the difference. And again, it's an individual race. I can't depend on you to run the race for me. You can help me, you can encourage me, you can uplift me. You can say, you need to read your Bible every day, David. Thank you for that. You're right, I do. You could say, things to encourage me in my race. Jesus says the man who builds his house on the rock, the words that he has, is the wise man. So, referring back, Paul says, with most of those, God was displeased. And if you recall, when they decided not to go up and take the promised land, two people over 20 got to see the promised land, Joshua and Caleb. That's most of the people God wasn't displeased with. Most of the people God was displeased with, right? Because of the actions that they took. They didn't have faith in God. In fact, to the point that they were worshiping Baal already. Let's read 7 through 13. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor let us act morally, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Man, grumble. I never grumble. I'm always upbeat. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. And I'm going to refer, as I just read that, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. Remember, Paul said, I got to make sure I'm not disqualified. No temptation has overtaken you, but such is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. And here are the things that Paul tells us not to be like, because the Israelites coming out of Egypt were like this, and with most of them, God was not happy with, right? And Paul says, look at their example. Look at the example of these guys and what happened to them. And that example is for us today too, folks. That example is for us today too. Paul says that there is no temptation that we cannot escape. God gives us a way out. He gives us a way out. And what I read into that is that God is not asking us to run a race that we cannot run. That He is there for us. That if you look for the way of escape, that temptation would not become a temptation anymore. And it goes back to that discipline we were talking about earlier. You have to discipline your body. I'm not going to get up tomorrow and run a marathon because my body's not in shape to do that. If you think you're going to go through this life and face temptations without the strength of the Word of God, without the strength of the Spirit in your life, it ain't going to happen, folks. It's not going to happen. We have to discipline ourselves, a spiritual discipline. And God says, there will be a way out. I will not cause you to sin. So we read in 2 Timothy that Paul did finish his race. 2 Timothy 4, 6, and 8. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved His appearing. In the New International Version, where it talks about finished the course, it says finished the race. And there is the prize that Paul gets, the crown of righteousness, the crown of everlasting life. And that's what we're running for, folks. And he stayed the course. Hebrews 12, 1 and 3. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. I'm just going to stop there before I continue. So have you seen the Olympics? Have you seen runners in the Olympics? Yes? They wear coveralls, big heavy boots. No, not so much, right? Because that would weigh them down. Have you ever tried to run in boots? It's tough. And that's what Paul is saying here. This sin that we have in our life, it's weighing us down. It entangles us. He says, let us run with endurance. This is not a 100-meter dash. You know, I'm 62 years old. There's people in here that have been Christians longer than me. And you would think it'd get easier as you get older, but sometimes it gets more difficult, right? It gets more difficult. It takes endurance. I've got to be honest. There were times I just wanted to say, you know, I quit. This is difficult. It's easier just to be like the world. So there is an endurance factor in here. So let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. And so he starts this off with a cloud of witnesses, and in Hebrews chapter 11 that precedes this, it talks about people of faith who lived a life of faith. Even through difficult circumstances, all their life they were faithful. Abraham, who was asked to offer up his son Isaac. How would you like to run that race? You know? So we have examples of people who have run the race and were successful at that, who accomplished it, who finished the race. And if it gets tough for us in this race, think of Jesus and what he endured for us so that we're not going to get weary, so that we won't lose heart. If we can offer any support in the race that you're running, if you want prayers of the congregation, if you wish to be baptized into the Lord today, you have that opportunity. We ask that you come forward this morning as we stand and sing.